Man notices insect trail and finds unexpected wealth. David Miller walked through the backyard of the house inherited from his grandmother with a heavy heart. At 34, he had just received the worst news of his professional life and felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. Elite Landscaping Solutions, the company where he had worked for 15 years as a landscaper, had closed all of a sudden, leaving every employee out on the street with no explanation. That was when he stopped in front of the flower bed, where his grandmother Eleanor used to plant roses, and noticed something that had never caught his attention before. Small golden trails sparkled in the morning sun, forming an organized path that snaked between the garden stones. Hundreds of ants carried tiny fragments that gleamed like little jewels, marching in single file with a precision that left him hypnotized. "David, are you going to stand there all day staring at bugs?" Rachel shouted from the kitchen window, his wife of 10 years. "We have bills to pay, and you're out there wasting time with ants." He didn't even answer. Something about those tiny creatures deeply intrigued him. He went back inside and searched the old kitchen drawer until he found the magnifying glass his grandmother used to read. When he returned to the backyard, he crouched down and began to observe more closely. The ants weren't just carrying dirt. The golden fragments were different, some brighter than others, as if they were tiny pieces of precious metal. David followed the trail with the magnifying glass, crawling along the ground like a curious child, oblivious to the disapproving look from his wife watching at the window. The line of insects led him to a specific area of the garden near the base of the century-old oak tree his grandmother had loved so much. There the ants simply disappeared among the tree's thick roots, as if entering a secret underground world. David stayed there for hours, watching the meticulous coming and going of the tiny workers. "This is the last straw." Rachel appeared in the backyard with her hands on her hips. "You lost your job, and instead of going out to look for work, you're playing like a kid in the backyard. Shame on you, David. What will the neighbors think?" "Rachel, take a look at this," he called out, showing one of the fragments he had managed to pick up. "These ants are carrying something strange." "What's strange is you, a grown man, down on all fours looking at ants," she replied, exasperated. "If you don't stop this nonsense and start looking for a job, I swear I'm going to my mother's house." But David couldn't take his eyes off those little golden fragments. There was something familiar about them, as if they awakened a distant memory. He vaguely remembered his grandmother Eleanor telling stories about hidden treasures, but he had always thought they were just tales to entertain a child. That night, after Rachel went to sleep, still grumbling about her husband's ridiculous obsession, David returned to the backyard with a flashlight. The ants had stopped their activities, but he could clearly see the trail they had left. He grabbed a small trowel from the shed and began to dig carefully near the oak tree's roots. The soil was soft, as if it had been disturbed before. After digging a few inches, his trowel hit something metallic. David's heart raced. With extra care, he cleared the dirt around it until he revealed a small, rusty metal box, the size of a shoebox. His hands trembled as he opened the lid. Inside were old coins, some simple jewelry, and a handwritten letter in his grandmother's neat handwriting. David brought the flashlight closer and began to read, "My dear grandson, if you're reading this, it means you finally noticed what I always saw. The ants have always been my faithful helpers. For years I left small pieces of gold for you, creating a living map that only someone as observant as you would discover. These are my life savings, kept with care for the day you might need them." David felt his eyes well up. The letter continued, "I always knew you inherited my eye for small details. When you were a child, you were the only one who noticed when I moved the flowers around or when a little bird built a new nest. I made sure the ants knew the way to my treasure. They're more reliable than any bank, my son." The next day, David woke up before dawn and went back to the spot. He wanted to make sure he hadn't been dreaming. The box was still there, as real as the sunlight beginning to illuminate the backyard. He examined the coins more closely and realized many of them were very old, some with dates from the last century. "Good morning, David," greeted his neighbor, Mr. George, a 70-year-old man who had lived next door for over 40 years. "Up early today, huh?" "Good morning, Mr. George," David replied, trying to hide his nervousness. "I saw you digging in the dirt last night. Everything all right over there?" asked the neighbor with a curious look. "Not trying to pry, but I found it odd you digging around in the dark." David felt a knot in his stomach. He couldn't tell anyone about the discovery, at least not yet. He needed to better understand what he had in his hands. "Oh, I'm thinking about making a new flower bed where my grandma used to plant flowers," he lied. "Wanted to check the soil." "I see." Mr. George didn't seem very convinced. "Well, if you need anything, just holler." When the neighbor walked away, David realized he needed to be more discreet. He took the box inside and hid it at the back of the closet, among old clothes Rachel never touched. Over the following days, he researched old coins online and became increasingly convinced he had something valuable in his hands. Some of the coins were rare, from specific periods in United States history that could be worth a lot of money to collectors. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. "David, you've been acting really strange," said Rachel during dinner. "You're always on the computer. You don't talk to me properly. What's going on?" "Nothing much, honey. I'm just looking for a job online." He lied again. "Then why won't you show me the listings you found? Why do you hide the screen when I get close?" David knew he wouldn't be able to fool her for long. Rachel had always been sharp and suspicious. He needed to do something before she figured it out on her own. The next day, he went downtown looking for an appraiser of old coins. He found a small, discreet shop called Heritage Antiques, run by a middle-aged man named Brian. "Interesting," said Brian, examining one of the coins with a professional magnifying glass. "This one is from 1892, and it's in great condition. Where did you get it?" "It was my grandmother's," David replied, trying to sound casual. Your grandmother had good taste in keeping coins," Brian continued, examining. "Look, I'll be straight with you. I'm interested in buying all the ones you brought. I can offer $5,000 for the lot." David was in shock. $5,000 was a lot of money, especially in his current situation. But something about Brian's demeanor made him suspicious. The man seemed too eager, his eyes gleaming in a way that didn't inspire trust. "I need to think," said David. "Can I come back tomorrow?" "Sure, but don't take too long. The collector's market is unstable, you know how it is," replied Brian, trying to pressure him. David left the store with his coins and a sinking feeling in his stomach. He decided to seek a second opinion. He searched the internet and found the name of Christopher Bennett, an appraiser with excellent references who worked at a more traditional store downtown. "My God," Christopher exclaimed as soon as he saw the coins. "Where did you get these? Some of these pieces are extremely rare." "Family inheritance," David replied, observing the man's genuine reaction. "Look, I'm going to be honest with you. This collection is worth far more than you imagine. Just this coin here," he pointed to one in particular, "is worth at least $15,000. It's from 1889, the year of the Gilded Age, limited minting, and there are 3 more here that are equally valuable." David felt his legs go weak. Brian had tried to completely deceive him. In total, calculating a conservative value to avoid creating unrealistic expectations, this collection is worth between $50,000 and $70,000, maybe more, depending on the interest of specific collectors. David's world turned upside down. $70,000 was more money than he had earned in 2 years of work, but Christopher wasn't finished yet. "There's something that intrigues me," the appraiser continued. "The pattern of these coins, the dates, the way they were preserved. It seems like whoever collected them knew exactly what they were doing. Did your grandmother understand numismatics?" "Actually, I don't know much about her," David admitted. "She died when I was still a teenager." "Well, she was a very intelligent woman. These coins were handpicked. This isn't a casual accumulation." David returned home in a state of shock. How would he tell Rachel? How would he explain that they suddenly had a fortune at home? And more importantly, were there more treasures hidden in the backyard? That night he returned to the spot where he had found the first box. The ants were there again, carrying their small golden fragments. This time, he followed them with more patience, observing every movement. He noticed that there wasn't just one trail, but several. Some ants followed a different, longer path that went around the house and led to an area behind the shed that he rarely visited. Intrigued, he followed this new route. The trail led him to a large, smooth stone that had always been there, but that he had never paid attention to. Upon closer examination, he noticed that the stone was positioned strangely, as if it were covering something. The ants disappeared into a small gap between the stone and the ground. With great effort, David managed to move the stone a few inches. Beneath it was a natural cavity in the soil, and inside it, another box, this one larger than the first. His heart raced again. "What's this about you digging in the backyard at dawn?" Rachel appeared behind him like a ghost, making him jump in fright. "Rachel, you scared me. Answer the question. What the hell are you doing?" David looked at his wife and realized there was no more hiding it. It was better to tell the truth before the situation became even more complicated. "Sit here with me," he said, quickly covering the box with the stone. "I need to tell you something." They sat on the back porch, and David told her everything, about the ants, about the first box, about the valuable coins. Rachel listened in silence, with an expression that shifted between disbelief and fascination. "Are you telling me that Mrs. Eleanor hid a fortune in the backyard and left the ants as a clue?" she asked finally. "Exactly. And these coins are really worth $70,000. At least that." Rachel was quiet for a few minutes, processing the information. Then her eyes lit up in a way that David hadn't seen in a long time. "And there's more stuff buried?" "I think so. I just found another box." "My God, David, we're going to be rich!" Rachel's excitement was contagious, but also concerning. David knew his wife well enough to know that she could be impulsive when it came to money. "Take it easy, Rachel. We need to go slowly. We don't know yet what's in the second box." "Then let's open it." They went back to the rock and together removed the second box from the hiding spot. This one was made of wood, more elaborate than the first, with small locks that were rusty but still functional. Inside, they found more coins, some delicate jewelry that seemed to be family heirlooms, and several old papers carefully wrapped in oilcloth. David opened the papers and found documents that left him speechless. "Rachel, look at this," he said with a trembling voice. "These are property documents. Documents that talk about mineral rights to this land. What does that mean?" "It means our property has rights to any minerals found underground. And look at the date on these papers. They're from 1920. My grandmother kept these for over 100 years. Rachel picked up one of the documents and tried to read the old legal language. "I don't understand any of this, David, but if it's talking about minerals, do you think there's real gold down here?" It was a possibility David hadn't considered. What if the golden fragments the ants were carrying weren't just from the treasures hidden by his grandmother, but from a natural source underground? "There's a way to find out," he said. "I'll go find someone who knows geology." The next day, David went to the State University and managed to talk to Professor Stephen Harrison, a retired geologist who still taught occasional classes. He explained the situation vaguely, saying he had found mineral traces on his property. "Interesting," said the professor after examining some fragments. "This is placer gold, quite small but genuine, and by the coloring I'd say it's good quality gold." "Professor, is it possible there's a vein or something like that on my property?" "Yes, it's possible. This region of Colorado had a lot of mining in the past. Many old properties still have mineral rights that the owners don't even know exist." The professor offered to do an informal technical visit to the property. David accepted immediately, eager to find out the truth. 2 days later, Professor Harrison arrived at David's house with some simple equipment. He did soil tests at various points in the backyard, paying special attention to the areas where the ants were most active. "David, you're lucky," said the professor after a few hours of analysis. "There are clear signs of gold mineralization underground. I can't guarantee the amount without a more in-depth study, but there's definitely gold here." Rachel, who had been watching everything from a distance, came running over. "Professor, does that mean we can extract gold here?" "Well, theoretically, yes, if you have the mineral rights. But it's a complex process. It requires permits, environmental studies, specialized equipment. And is it expensive? Asked David. Very expensive for a private individual. Usually landowners form partnerships with mining companies or sell the rights. When the professor left, David and Rachel stayed silent, trying to absorb the magnitude of the discovery. Not only did they have valuable coins, but possibly a continuous source of income through mining. "David," said Rachel with her eyes shining, "we need to sell everything and get out of here. Buy a big house downtown, start a new life." "Wait, Rachel, we can't be hasty. If there really is gold here, maybe it's better to explore it properly. Do things the right way." "Do things the right way?" "David, you're unemployed. We have bills piling up. This isn't the time to be a dreamer." The difference in perspectives created the first real tension between them since the discovery. Rachel wanted immediate liquidity, financial security. David felt there was something bigger at stake, something his grandmother had carefully planned. That night, he went back to the backyard alone and watched the ants again. There was something hypnotic about their movements, something that connected him to the memory of his grandmother. He remembered her saying there was always a reason for everything in nature, that you needed patience to understand. That was when he noticed something new. A third trail of ants, even more discreet, heading toward the back of the property, where there was a somewhat abandoned area covered in wild plants. This trail was different from the others. The ants were carrying larger, shinier fragments. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out as we're just getting started. Now continuing, David followed this new trail with his flashlight, making his way through the vegetation. The plants had grown so much they formed almost a green tunnel. At the end of this natural tunnel, he found a small clearing where there was an old, half-collapsed structure that looked like an old tool shed. The ants disappeared under the rubble of the structure. David began carefully removing stones and rotten wood, and soon found an entrance to what seemed to be a basement or underground cellar. His heart racing, he went down the uneven stone steps. The space below was bigger than he expected, clearly built with a purpose, and in the center there was a third box, this one made of sturdier metal and much larger than the previous ones. When he opened it, David nearly fainted. The box was full of small gold bars, more elaborate jewelry, more documents, and at the bottom a detailed map hand-drawn by his grandmother. The map showed the entire property divided into sections, with symbols indicating where to find natural deposits, emergency boxes, and main zone. A letter accompanied the map. "My dear David, if you've made it this far, you've already understood that the ants were just the beginning. This property holds secrets our family has protected for generations. Your great-grandfather discovered gold here in 1920, but kept it secret to protect the family from intruders and opportunists. Since then, each generation has extracted small amounts to live with dignity, always respecting the land and keeping the secret." The letter continued. "The documents you found are legitimate. Our family has always had rights to this land and its resources, but more important than the gold is the responsibility that comes with it. Use it to help your community, to create something lasting, not just to get rich quickly." David stayed in the basement for hours, rereading the letter and studying the map. His grandmother had planned everything meticulously. The different hiding spots were a security system. If someone found one, they wouldn't necessarily find the others. And the ants were the perfect navigation system, because only someone with patience and keen observation skills would uncover the secret. When he got home, dawn was already breaking. Rachel was waiting for him awake, clearly irritated. "Where were you? Gone all night." David told her about the third discovery, but he noticed that the more he talked, the more anxious and impatient Rachel seemed. "David, enough. I can't take this mystery and ant story anymore. We have a fortune at home and you're playing treasure hunt." "Rachel, you don't understand. This isn't a game. My grandmother left a legacy, a plan. Plan, my foot! Your grandmother was an eccentric old lady who buried things in the backyard. What matters is that we can sell everything and sort out our lives." The argument intensified. Rachel demanded that he immediately sell all the coins and jewelry, take the money and get out of that old dirty house. David resisted, feeling that there was something deeper at stake. "If you don't sell those coins this week, I'm leaving for my mother's house and I won't come back," Rachel shouted, slamming the bedroom door. David was left alone in the living room, looking out the window at the backyard where it all had begun. The ants kept up their tireless work, oblivious to the human drama unfolding around them. The next day he went back to talk to Professor Stephen and told him everything about the documents, the map, the discoveries. The professor was fascinated. "David, you have something very rare in your hands. A property with clear mineral rights, evidence of gold, and on top of that, complete historical documentation. This is worth much more than you imagine." "Professor, if I wanted to explore this properly without destroying the environment, would it be possible?" "Of course. These days there's sustainable low-impact mining. You could create a small family business, generate jobs in the region, extract gold in a controlled way. It would be a beautiful project." The idea excited David. He pictured himself creating jobs for neighbors, respecting the environment, honoring his grandmother's legacy. But when he got home, he found Rachel packing her bags. "Decided. Are you selling or not?" "Rachel, listen. The professor said we can create a company, do sustainable mining, help the community. I don't want to hear about companies or community. I want out of this mediocre life. I want money in the bank, a new house, a new car. If you don't sell those damn coins today, I'm leaving." David looked at his wife and realized they wanted completely different things. Rachel saw the treasure as an escape from their current life. He saw it as an opportunity to build something meaningful. Even so, he didn't want to lose the marriage. He made a deal. He would sell half the coins to ease the immediate financial situation, but he would keep the other half and the mineral rights to develop the project in the long term. "Fine," Rachel agreed, less enthusiastic than he had expected. "But I want my share of the money separate. I don't trust you to handle everything on your own." It was a comment that hurt deeply. David realized that the discovery of the treasure, instead of bringing them together, was revealing fundamental differences between them. He sold half the coins to Christopher Bennett for $40,000. He gave $20,000 to Rachel and kept $20,000 to invest in the mining project. With the money, Rachel paid off all the house debts and there was still a considerable amount left. "Now I can sleep peacefully," she said, looking more relaxed than she had been in months. David used his $20,000 to hire a lawyer specialized in mineral rights and start the legal proceedings for a small mining operation. The process was complex, involving environmental licenses, impact studies, and municipal approvals. But he was determined to do everything right. During this period, something unexpected happened. News about the valuable coins had leaked through the appraiser Christopher, who mentioned the exceptional discovery to colleagues. Soon, people started showing up at the property. First, a man who introduced himself as a local history researcher, interested in seeing the house with historical heritage. Then others came, some posing as land buyers, others as curious neighbors. "David," said Mr. George, the neighbor, "there are some strange guys hanging around your house at night. Yesterday I saw 2 people with flashlights in your backyard. The situation was getting dangerous." David realized he needed to act quickly to protect what was left of the treasure. He installed simple cameras around the property and hired a security company to do nightly patrols. But this only increased the speculation in the neighborhood about what he was hiding. That was when he received the first official offer. A local businessman named William Sterling showed up at his door with an offer that left him dizzy. $2 million for the property. "Mr. Miller, I know your family has roots here, but $2 million is a lot of money. You could buy a mansion anywhere," said William, a well-dressed man in his 50s. "Why exactly do you want to pay so much for this property?" asked David, suspicious. "I'm interested in developing a tourist venture in the area. Your house has historic charm, the land is large, it would be perfect for a boutique hotel." David didn't believe the hotel story for even a second. $2 million was an absurdly high amount for an ordinary property. William knew about the gold. "I'll think about the offer," said David diplomatically. After William left, David looked him up on the internet. He discovered the man was a partner in a mining company that had gone bankrupt a few years earlier, due to irregular environmental practices. Clearly, William had found out about the mineral rights through public records or leaked information. "2 million, David," Rachel exclaimed when she heard about the offer. "We could sell and live like kings for the rest of our lives." "Rachel, if he's offering 2 million, it's because the property is worth much more than that. He wants to extract the gold and leave the land destroyed." "So what? What matters is our future." The pressure was coming from all sides. Rachel kept insisting they accept the offer. Neighbors started making comments about strange people lurking around the house, and William called every day, gradually increasing his offer. That was when David had an idea. He sought out Professor Stephen again and proposed a partnership. The professor would contribute technical knowledge, David would contribute the property and resources, and together they would create a small, sustainable artisanal mining company. "That's a fascinating idea, David. We can do low-impact extraction, create local jobs, and establish a model of responsible mining. It would be a pioneering project." "Professor, there's something I haven't told you yet. My grandmother left a detailed map of the deposits. She knew exactly where the gold was. When Stephen saw the map, he was impressed. David, this is decades of work. Your grandmother mapped the entire land with scientific precision. Look at these symbols. She even calculated the approximate gold concentrations in each area. How did she know so much about mining? Her family had been working these claims for generations. She probably learned from the elders. And look at this. The professor pointed to notes in the corner of the map. She even planned extraction methods that wouldn't harm the water table or the vegetation. David was moved. His grandmother wasn't just an old lady who buried treasures. She was a true expert who thought about the future. With the technical support of Professor Stephen, David was able to speed up the licensing process. The sustainable artisanal mining proposal positively impressed the environmental agencies, which rarely saw such well-planned projects. But the problems at home increased. Rachel was growing more impatient and irritated by the day. William's offer had already risen to 3 million, and she couldn't understand why David kept turning down so much money. "You're being selfish," she shouted during a particularly intense argument. "You're only thinking about yourself and this obsession with your dead grandmother. What about me? What about our future? What about the children we could have? Rachel, the project will bring in much more money in the long run, and in a sustainable way, creating jobs for the community. I don't care about the community. I care about our family." The argument ended with Rachel packing her bags for good and going to her mother's house. Before leaving, she made it clear, "When you get tired of playing miner and decide to accept William's money, call me. Until then, I don't want anything to do with you." David was left alone in the house, surrounded by his grandmother's treasures and the problems they had created. For the first time since finding the first box, he wondered whether the discovery had been a blessing or a curse. But when he looked out the window and saw the ants continuing their meticulous work, he remembered his grandmother's patience and determination. She had waited decades for the right person to discover her secret. He couldn't give up now. 3 months later, David received the first approved permits for artisanal mining. Professor Stephen brought basic equipment, and they began the first extraction tests. The results were better than they had expected. "David, by preliminary calculations, you have enough gold here for a sustainable operation of at least 10 years, said the professor, examining the samples. "And if we do it right, it could be much more." Word spread through the neighborhood, but this time in a positive way. Neighbors began to take an interest in the project, seeing an opportunity for local employment. Mr. George was the first to offer to work in the mining operation. "I always knew there was something special about this property," said the neighbor. "Your grandmother was a very wise woman. She told me once that she was saving something for future generations." Gradually, David discovered that other long-time residents of the street also had suspicions about the property. Mrs. Martha, an 80-year-old woman who lived 3 houses away, said she had seen Grandma Eleanor talking to geologists decades ago. "She was very reserved, but once she told me that our region had a golden past that few knew about," recalled Mrs. Martha. The mining operation started small, with just David, Professor Stephen, and 2 neighbors. They extracted gold twice a week, using artisanal methods that didn't harm the environment. The backyard remained almost unchanged. The excavations were small and carefully planned. The ants, surprisingly, were not disturbed by the work. They simply adapted their routes, creating new paths that went around the extraction areas. It was as if they understood that human activity was part of the local ecosystem. After 6 months of operation, David had already recovered his entire initial investment and started turning a profit. More importantly, he had created jobs for 8 people in the neighborhood and established a mining model that was attracting attention from other towns. That was when Rachel came back. "Hi, David," she said, appearing at the door on a Thursday afternoon. "Can I come in?" She looked different, thinner, with an expression that mixed regret and curiosity. "Of course, this is your home too," David replied, trying to hide his emotion at seeing her. "I heard the project worked out, that you guys are making real money. It's true, and more importantly, we're helping the community." Rachel walked through the rooms of the house, noticing the small improvements David had made. New floors, fresh paint, better furniture. "I owe you an apology. I was selfish. I couldn't see beyond the immediate money," she said, sitting on the sofa. "My mother really made me think. She said I was throwing away a marriage out of greed." "Rachel, you weren't just greedy, you were afraid. Afraid of staying in the difficult financial situation we were in. I understand. But you were right. What you built here is so much bigger than any amount William could have offered." "William is still out there, by the way," David said, laughing. "He called last week offering $5 million. I think he's desperate." "And you refused $5 million?" asked Rachel, impressed. "Rachel, what we have here is worth far more than money. It's worth a sustainable future, jobs for our community, respect for the environment. And above all, it's worth honoring my grandmother's memory." That night, they talked until dawn. Rachel told him how lost and regretful she had felt in recent months. David shared the challenges and joys of building the mining project. "Can I be a part of this?" she asked. "I want to help. I want to learn. I want to understand what your grandmother planned." "Of course you can. Actually, I was thinking about expanding into the administrative side. We need someone to handle the accounting, the legal matters." "I'd love that. And David, there's something I need to tell you. While I was at my mom's house, I started researching Mrs. Eleanor. I found some interesting things." "What kind of things?" "She was known in the region as a sort of counselor. People came from far away to ask her for advice about business, agriculture, even family problems. She had a reputation for being very wise." "I didn't know that." "And there's more. I found old records at the public library. Your family arrived here in 1890 during the gold rush in Colorado. They weren't ordinary miners. They were specialized prospectors who could find gold where others couldn't." David was fascinated. His heritage was far richer than he had imagined. It wasn't just gold, but traditional knowledge passed down through generations. "Rachel, this changes everything. Maybe we can expand the project, teach sustainable prospecting techniques to other communities." "Exactly. We can create a knowledge center. Keep your family's tradition alive." David and Rachel's reconciliation marked the beginning of a new phase for the project. With her handling the administration, he could devote himself completely to the technical aspects of mining. Professor Stephen Harrison brought students from the State University to study the sustainable model they had developed. A year later, the mining operation employed 15 people and had become a regional reference in sustainability. David and Rachel used part of the profits to improve the neighborhood's infrastructure. They paved streets, installed better lighting, and created a small square. The ants continued their activities, now observed with affection and respect by the entire work team. David placed small signs around the backyard, explaining the insects' role in the discovery, turning them into a sort of mascot for the project. "You know what impresses me the most?" said Professor Stephen Harrison one afternoon, watching the ants work. "Your grandmother created the region's first natural GPS system. The ants are more efficient than any technology we have." News about the sustainable mining project reached regional newspapers, then national ones. David began receiving invitations to give lectures on sustainability and responsible mining. His grandmother's house became a point of visitation for geology and business students. But success brought new challenges. William Sterling hadn't given up and had started putting pressure through City Hall, questioning the permits and creating bureaucratic obstacles. He had discovered that other properties in the region also had mineral potential and wanted to force a general expropriation. "David, we need to prepare for a legal fight," said the lawyer he had hired. "William is mobilizing his political contacts to change the local mining legislation. What can we do?" "Two things. First, document everything you do here. Show that this is an exemplary model. Second, mobilize the community. If the residents support you publicly, it becomes harder for him to apply political pressure." David organized a meeting in the town square to explain the situation to the neighbors. To his surprise, more than 100 people showed up, including residents from nearby neighborhoods who had heard about the project. "Folks," he said to the crowd, "you know our project created jobs and improvements for the region, but now there are people trying to tear all of that down for predatory mining." The reaction was immediate. Neighbors stood up to talk about how their lives had improved, how the neighborhood was more prosperous, how good it was to have local work. Mrs. Martha, at 80 years old, gave an emotional speech. "I've lived here for 60 years. I've seen this region go through ups and downs. I've never seen anything as beautiful as what David and Rachel built. They respected the land. They respected the people. They created opportunities. We're not going to let anyone destroy this." The community support was overwhelming. They created a petition with more than 500 signatures supporting the project and opposing any attempt at expropriation. The story reached the local press, then the national press. William, seeing that he had lost public support, changed his strategy. Instead of trying to expropriate, he began offering partnerships to other landowners in the region, trying to surround David's property with larger operations. "He's being clever," said Professor Stephen. "If he can control the surrounding properties, he can influence our operation indirectly." "We have to get to the neighbors first," Rachel replied. "Offer fair partnerships before he convinces them with false promises." They spent weeks talking to owners of neighboring plots, explaining the sustainable model, offering technical consulting to anyone who wanted to develop responsible mining. The strategy worked. 5 nearby properties joined the project, creating an artisanal mining cooperative. The cooperative became even stronger than the individual operation. They shared equipment, technical knowledge, and operational costs. The model was so successful that it caught the attention of the state government, which created an incentive program for sustainable mining based on what David had developed. "You've created something revolutionary," said the state representative who came to visit the project. "We're studying how to turn this into public policy for the entire state." 2 years after the initial discovery, David found himself in a situation he had never imagined. He was a successful businessman, a reference in sustainability, an employer of more than 30 people. But what made him most proud was that he had honored his grandmother's legacy. "You know what I think is most incredible?" Rachel said one night as they watched the ants in the illuminated backyard. "Your grandmother waited almost 20 years for you to discover the secret. She trusted that you would do the right thing." "And the ants keep working," David observed, "as if they know they're part of something bigger." That week they received 2 important pieces of news. The first was that the project had been selected to represent the United States at an international conference on sustainable mining. The second was that Rachel was pregnant. "Our daughter is going to grow up knowing this story," she said, her hand on her still flat belly. "She'll know from a young age the value of patience, of observation, of respect for nature. And she'll get to know her great-grandmother through this house, this backyard, these ants." William Sterling made one last attempt, offering to buy the entire cooperative for $10 million. This time neither David nor any of the partners was interested in the offer. They had discovered something far more valuable than money, a purpose, a community, a legacy. "Thank you, but we're not interested," David said politely when William made the final offer. "What we have here is not for sale." "You're crazy," replied William. You're turning down the chance to be millionaires." "Actually," said Rachel, joining the conversation, "we're already millionaires. Maybe not in the sense you mean, but in everything that truly matters." After William left, definitively defeated, David and Rachel sat on the porch where it had all begun. The backyard was more beautiful than ever. The plants had grown around the mining areas, creating a garden that blended nature and human activity in perfect harmony. "Do you think your grandmother could have imagined it would come to this?" asked Rachel. "I think she knew exactly what she was doing. The map she left had more than just indications of where to find gold. It had guidance on how to build a sustainable future." At that moment, as if they understood the conversation, the ants marched in single file right in front of them, carrying small fragments that glinted in the afternoon light. Some fragments were natural, others were remnants of the mining activities that they had incorporated into their daily work. "They've adapted perfectly," observed David. "Our activity became part of their ecosystem, and theirs became part of ours," Rachel finished. 3 years later, the Sustainable Mining Cooperative had expanded to 12 properties and employed more than 60 people. The neighborhood had been completely transformed. Renovated houses, thriving businesses, young people who once left in search of opportunities now stayed to work locally. David and Rachel's daughter, Eleanor, named in honor of her grandmother, grew up running through the backyard, watching the ants with the same curiosity her father had shown years before. At 2 years old, she already knew how to follow the insects' trails and was fascinated by their tiny golden loads. "She has the family's eye," said Mrs. Martha, who had become something of an adoptive grandmother to the girl. "She sees things that others don't." The traditional knowledge center that David and Rachel had created received visits from researchers all over the world. The community library housed not only the documents left by Grandma Eleanor, but also new studies on sustainable mining, family farming, and environmental preservation. "What you've built here has transcended mining," said Professor Stephen, now retired but still involved in the project. "You've created a development model that respects the past, makes the most of the present, and prepares for the future." The house where it all began had become the heart of the community center. The backyard, carefully preserved, was used for hands-on classes on nature observation, sustainability, and cooperation. The ants were protected as the community's living heritage. "Daddy," said Eleanor one afternoon at 3 years old with a well-developed vocabulary, "why do the ants carry little golden pebbles?" "Because they're very hard-working and organized, sweetheart. They taught us that small things can lead to great discoveries. When I grow up, can I follow the ants too?" "Of course you can. This will be your inheritance, just as it was mine." David looked at his daughter, then at the backyard where the ants continued their eternal work, and finally at Rachel, who was organizing documents on the porch. It had all begun with his unexpected layoff, with the desperation of a man without work watching insects in the garden. Now 5 years later, he understood that the layoff hadn't been an ending, but a beginning planned by a wise woman who knew her grandson had the eyes and the heart needed to discover, preserve, and multiply the treasure she had so carefully guarded. The ants kept carrying their golden fragments, creating trails that connected past and future, tradition and innovation, family and community. And David knew that, as long as there were people willing to observe, learn, and respect, his grandmother Eleanor's legacy would remain alive, growing like the plants in the backyard, strong like the roots of the old oak tree, eternal like the patient work of the tiny insects that had changed his life forever. At the end of that golden afternoon, as the family got ready for dinner, David made one last visit to the places where it all had begun. The first hiding spot, now marked with a discreet plaque. The second, transformed into a memorial garden. The third, which had become the cooperative's operations center. In every place the ants kept up their activities. They had become the true guardians of the treasure, protecting not just the physical gold, but the knowledge, the tradition, and the wisdom that represented the true wealth of that land. "Thank you, Grandma," David whispered, knowing that somewhere, somehow, his grandmother Eleanor was smiling as she saw that her plan had worked perfectly. The treasure was not just the buried gold, but everything that had blossomed from the patience of observing what others ignored. And the ants continued their work, carrying small fragments of gold and great life lessons in an eternal dance between nature and humanity that had become the symbol of a community transformed by the power of observation, patience, and respect for the legacy of those who came before. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. 10 years had passed since that first day when David had watched the ants carrying golden fragments. The unemployed, hopeless boy had become a respected businessman, but more importantly than that, a guardian of traditions and a builder of futures. The Sustainable Mining Cooperative now covered the entire region, employed more than 200 people, and had become a model for similar projects in 3 states. The Traditional Knowledge Center received international delegations and had published several studies on sustainable community development. Eleanor, now 8 years old, knew every ant trail in the backyard and had developed her own theory about why they chose certain fragments over others. Her observations, recorded in a little notebook that Grandma Rachel had given her as a gift, impressed adult researchers with their precision and creativity. "Dad," she said one Saturday morning, "I found a new trail. The ants are carrying different, larger fragments." David followed his daughter to an area of the backyard he rarely visited near the back wall. Indeed, there was a new ant trail, wider than the others, with insects carrying considerably larger fragments. "How long have you noticed this?" he asked. 3 weeks. At first I thought it was temporary, but they keep the routine every day." Intrigued, David followed the trail with the same curiosity that had led him to the original discoveries. The ants led him to an area where some ancient stones formed a kind of natural semicircle. It was a place that had always been there, but that he had never paid special attention to. "Eleanor, do you think we should dig here?" "I think so, Dad. Ants never lie." Carefully, they began to remove the stones. Underneath, they found not a material treasure, but something even more valuable, a set of stones carved with indigenous symbols, clearly very ancient, and one last letter from grandmother Eleanor. "My dear David, if you are reading this, it means that the 3rd generation of the family has developed the same capacity for observation that brought us here. These stones were left by the original peoples of this land and contain knowledge about the region that our family has always respected and protected." The letter explained that the property was not only rich in gold, but also in history. The indigenous peoples who inhabited the region centuries before already knew about the mineral deposits and had developed sustainable extraction methods that David's family had adapted and preserved. "Eleanor," he said to his daughter, "you have just discovered that our history is even older and richer than we imagined. And the ants knew about it all along?" "It seems so. They are the true guardians of this land." The discovery of the indigenous stones brought a new dimension to the project. David contacted the Institute of Historic Heritage and anthropologists specializing in local cultures. The analyses confirmed that the stones dated back at least 500 years and contained valuable information about ancient sustainable mining practices. "You are not just miners," said anthropologist Dr. Susan Harrison after studying the findings. "You are carrying on an age-old tradition of harmonious coexistence with the land." The official recognition of the property's historical importance brought new support and resources. The federal government created a special program for the preservation of historical sites with cultural and economic value. The cooperative received resources to expand its educational and cultural activities. But perhaps the most important discovery was the understanding that Grandma Eleanor's legacy went far beyond her individual life. She had been the guardian of ancestral knowledge that spanned generations, peoples, and cultures. "Now I understand why Grandma knew so much about mining," said Rachel. "She didn't invent anything. She just preserved and adapted wisdom that had existed for hundreds of years." The house's backyard officially became a protected archaeological site. The ants, now recognized as an integral part of the historical ecosystem, had their trails mapped and protected. Researchers discovered that they had been transporting fragments between different underground archaeological sites, creating a true natural museum. Eleanor became the unofficial mascot of the project, At 8 years old, she already participated in sustainability conferences, always accompanied by a small terrarium with ants that she would bring to show how the natural navigation system discovered by the family worked. The ants are like librarians, she would explain to fascinated adult audiences. They organize and preserve important information for future generations. The analogy was so perfect that it became the title of a documentary about the project. The Golden Librarians: How an American Family Discovered a Treasure by Following Ants. The documentary, shown on international channels, brought even more attention to the region. Tourists began to visit not only to learn about sustainable mining, but to see the famous gold ants and learn about observing nature. "I never imagined I'd be a tour guide for ants," joked David during one of the guided tours. "You're not a tour guide," Rachel replied. "You're a storyteller, and the story you tell changes people's lives." It was true. Many visitors returned to their cities inspired to better observe the nature around them, to value traditional knowledge, and to seek more sustainable forms of development. The project had become a radiating center of environmental and social awareness. 15 years after the first discovery, David was invited to speak at the United Nations about sustainable development based on traditional knowledge. In the audience, representatives from dozens of countries heard the story of the ants that led an American family to discover not only gold, but a way of living in harmony with nature and with the community. "It all started with unemployment," he told the delegates. "I thought I had lost everything. In truth, I had been given the chance to discover who I really was and what my purpose in life was." At the end of the presentation, he received invitations to replicate the model in other countries. Several pilot projects were already being developed in Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia, always respecting local particularities and the traditional knowledge of each region. Eleanor, now 13, had decided she wanted to study entomology and anthropology. Her goal was to better understand the relationship between social insects and the preservation of ancestral knowledge. Her observations of the family's ants had already resulted in 2 scientific articles published in specialized journals. "Dad, I discovered that ants have a collective memory," she said during dinner. "They pass on information about roots and resources through generations, just like Grandma Eleanor did with us." "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "The ants working today aren't the same ones from 10 years ago, but they still follow the same trails, carry fragments from the same places. Someone taught them where to look." Eleanor's observation inspired a new line of research at the university. Scientists began studying how ants transmitted spatial information across generations and how that related to the preservation of traditional human knowledge. "Your daughter may have made a revolutionary discovery," said Professor Stephen, now 80 years old but still mentally sharp. "If we can understand how ants preserve and transmit spatial knowledge, we can learn a great deal about our own ability to preserve traditions." The family's backyard became an open-air natural laboratory. Students from several universities did internships there, learning not only about sustainable mining, but also about scientific observation, cultural preservation, and community development. Rachel, who had specialized in sustainable project management, was invited to direct a new government program for solidarity economy based on traditional knowledge. The program aimed to identify and support communities that, like theirs, possessed ancestral knowledge that could be transformed into sustainable economic activities. "It's amazing how our story has multiplied," she said during a program meeting. "It started with a man watching ants, and now it's national public policy." The project's impact had exceeded any expectation. The region had become a benchmark hub for sustainable development, attracting investments in education, research, and responsible tourism. What was once an underprivileged outlying neighborhood had transformed into a thriving, internationally recognized community. But the most important aspect remained the family. David and Rachel had built not only a successful business, but a legacy that Eleanor and future generations could continue to develop. "You know what I'm most proud of?" David said one afternoon, watching his daughter lead a group of visitors through the backyard. "It's not the money we've earned or the recognition we've received. It's seeing that Eleanor understands the responsibility that comes with this knowledge." She has her great-grandmother's wisdom and our generation's scientific curiosity, Rachel agreed. She'll take this much further than we ever could. Eleanor had developed a project to map all the ant trails in the region and correlate them with historical sites and mineral deposits. Her hypothesis was that the insects had created a natural information network that could help in the discovery and preservation of other sites of historical and archaeological interest. If I'm right, she explained to a team of researchers, we can use ants as guides to find other important sites in the region, preserving them before they are damaged by predatory human activities. Eleanor's project received support from the Institute of Historic Heritage and from national and international universities. At 14, she had become the youngest researcher to coordinate an archaeological mapping project in the country. My daughter is doing what it took me 15 years to do, David joked, and doing it better. It's natural evolution, Rachel replied. Each generation should go further than the one before. 20 years after the first discovery, the family received a special tribute from the Capitol for their contribution to sustainable development and the preservation of American cultural heritage. During the ceremony in Washington, D.C., David couldn't help thinking about his grandmother, Eleanor, and how proud she would be to see what her patience and wisdom had made possible. It all started with a simple observation, he said in his thank you speech. My grandmother taught me that the answers we seek are often right in front of us, waiting only for us to have the humility to observe and the patience to learn. In the audience, Eleanor listened proudly. At 14, she had already decided that she would dedicate her life to continuing the work started by her father and great-grandmother. But her focus would be on expanding knowledge beyond mining, studying how different traditional cultures had developed systems of observing nature to guide their economic and social activities. Dad, she said during the flight back home, I want to create an international institute for traditional knowledge and sustainability, a place where people from all over the world can come to learn about observing nature and responsible development. That's an ambitious dream, sweetheart. All great projects start as ambitious dreams. Yours started with ants in the backyard. David smiled, realizing that his daughter had inherited not only the family's gift for observation, but also the long-term vision that had characterized his grandmother Eleanor. When they got home that night, they made a ritual visit to the backyard. The ants were there, as always, continuing their patient, organized work. After 2 decades, they still followed the same basic trails, still carried golden fragments, still served as inspiration and guide for the family that had learned to see them as teachers. They don't change, Eleanor observed. They just keep perfecting. Like all true wisdom, David agreed, principles are eternal, but their applications evolve over time. And the next generations will discover applications we can't even imagine today. Rachel joined them in the backyard, bringing a photo album that documented the family's entire journey. There were photos of the first excavation, the discovery of the boxes, the early days of mining, the growth of the cooperative, the international visits, the awards received. Look at this, she said, showing a specific photo. This is from the first day you observed the ants, David. You're crouched on the ground, with Grandma's old magnifying glass. I remember it perfectly, he replied. I was desperate, out of work, with no prospects. If someone had told me that day that it would change our entire lives, I wouldn't have believed it. And this one, Rachel pointed to another photo, is of Eleanor at 2 years old, following the ants for the first time. You could already tell she had inherited the family's eye. Eleanor studied the photos with scientific and emotional interest. It's amazing how the ant trails are exactly the same in every photo. 20 years later, they still follow the same basic paths. Maybe because the paths are right, suggested David. When something works for a long time, there's usually a deep reason for it. Or maybe, said Eleanor with that gleam in her eyes that always appeared when she had a new theory, it's because they're following something we can't see, something underground, an energy, a magnetic field. Another hypothesis for your future studies, laughed Rachel. That night, after Eleanor went to bed, David and Rachel were alone on the porch looking at the backyard lit by the full moon. 20 years of changes, achievements, discoveries, and growth. From a couple desperate with financial problems, they had become leaders of an international sustainability movement. Have you ever thought about what would have happened if you hadn't observed the ants that day? Asked Rachel. Sometimes I think about it. I probably would have found another job, lived an ordinary life, and Grandma's treasure would have stayed buried forever. And our daughter wouldn't have become such a precocious scientist. The cooperative wouldn't exist. Hundreds of people wouldn't have jobs. It's frightening to think how small decisions can change everything, agreed David. If I had ignored the ants, if I had accepted William Sterling's first offer, if I hadn't trusted Grandma's wisdom. But you made the right choices because you have the right heart. They stayed silent for a few minutes, listening to the nighttime sounds of the backyard. Crickets, owls, the wind in the leaves of the old oak tree. It was the same soundtrack that had accompanied the family's entire journey. "David," said Rachel finally, "do you think Grandma Eleanor planned all of this? This entire impact that your discovery had? I don't know if she imagined the exact magnitude, but I'm sure she knew she was planting seeds for something much bigger than our individual needs. She always thought in terms of community, of future, of responsibility. And she succeeded. Even after death, she's still changing lives. Not just after death. As long as there are people willing to observe, learn, and respect, Grandma Eleanor will be alive through her legacy." At that moment, as if they had heard the conversation, some ants appeared on the porch, carrying small fragments that gleamed in the moonlight. They passed between the couple's feet and continued their nightly journey, following invisible trails that connected past, present, and future. "They never stop," observed Rachel. "Like life," responded David. "Like dreams. Like love. Like everything that truly matters." And the ants continued their eternal work, carrying small treasures through the night, guardians of ancient secrets and builders of futures not yet imagined, in a silent dance between nature and humanity that had become the perfect symbol of everything that patient observation and a generous heart can build. The next day, Eleanor woke up with a new idea. She wanted to create an ant journal, documenting their activities day by day, correlating them with climate factors, changes in vegetation and human activities in the region. Her goal was to understand if there were patterns that could help preserve other historic sites. "Dad, can I use the cooperative's lab for more precise analyses?" "Of course, sweetheart. But why the urgency with the ant journal?" "Because they're getting old. The original colony that led you to your discoveries is over 20 years old. If I don't document everything now, I might lose important information when the generational transition happens." His daughter's observation made David realize something he hadn't considered. The ants that had guided him to the treasures truly were aging as a colony. Although there were always new generations, behavioral patterns could change over time. "You're right," he said. "We need to preserve this knowledge before it's lost." Eleanor then began the most ambitious project of her young scientific career, a longitudinal study on spatial knowledge transmission in ant colonies that interacted with historical human activities. It was a topic no researcher had explored before. If I can prove that ants truly transmit specific information about resources across generations, I'll be able to apply that to discover other lost archaeological sites, she explained to Professor Stephen. "It's a fascinating hypothesis," the professor agreed, "and you have the perfect natural laboratory to test it." Eleanor's project drew attention from universities around the world. Researchers specializing in animal behavior, archaeology, and anthropology came together to support the study. The family's backyard officially became the world's first applied ethno-entomology laboratory. "I never thought my backyard would become an international research center," David joked during a video conference with scientists from 5 countries. "Nor did I think my casual observation of ants would turn into my 14-year-old daughter's doctoral thesis," Rachel laughed. But the most impressive part was seeing how Eleanor had developed a rigorous scientific methodology to study something that had begun as childhood curiosity. She used cutting-edge equipment to track the ants' movements, analyze the chemical composition of the fragments they carried, and map connections between different trails. "What I've discovered so far is incredible," she said during a presentation to the international team. "The ants aren't just following simple chemical trails. They're navigating a 3-dimensional information network that includes soil mineral composition, moisture, temperature, and even natural electromagnetic fields. "How did a 14-year-old girl develop such advanced knowledge?" asked a researcher from France. "By growing up in direct contact with the subject of study," Eleanor answered naturally. "When you spend 24 hours a day observing something, you develop intuitions that complement theoretical knowledge." The answer impressed the scientists. It was exactly the kind of traditional knowledge based on prolonged observation that universities tried to replicate in laboratories but rarely managed to achieve. 6 months later, Eleanor published the first results of her research. The findings were revolutionary. The ants really did transmit specific spatial information across generations, and that transmission was directly related to the presence of valuable minerals underground. In other words, she explained during an interview, ants are natural prospectors that have been working for millions of years. They know how to find gold better than any equipment we've developed. Eleanor's scientific discovery fully validated Grandma Eleanor's intuition and David's observations. More than that, it paved the way for a new form of mineral prospecting based on animal behavior. "Your family accidentally discovered the future of sustainable mining," said the director of the National Institute of Mineral Research. "Instead of drilling blindly into the earth, we can follow the natural guides that have already mapped out the resources." The methodology Eleanor developed was tested in other regions of the country. In every case, ant colonies in areas with a mining history showed behavioral patterns that indicated the presence of precious metals underground. "It's as if nature created its own geological mapping system," said Eleanor during an international conference, "and we just need to learn to read the signs that were always there." Eleanor's work earned her invitations to study at the world's best universities, but she decided to stay in the United States and create her Institute of Traditional Knowledge in the very region where it all began. "It makes no sense to study nature observation far from the nature that taught me," she explained. "My laboratory is this backyard, this community, these ants. Here I have everything I need to revolutionize science." At 15, Eleanor became the youngest person to receive the National Scientific Innovation Award. In her acceptance speech, she dedicated the award to the great-grandmother she had never met personally, but who had been her greatest teacher. "Grandma Eleanor taught me that true science begins with the humility to observe and the patience to understand. She taught me through the ants that small things can reveal great truths." That night, the family organized a small gathering in the backyard to celebrate the award. Neighbors, cooperative workers, researchers and friends gathered around the trees where it all began. "Our toast," said David, raising his glass, "to Grandma Eleanor, who taught us that observing nature is the oldest and most effective way of doing science." "And to the ants," added Eleanor, laughing, "who are the true scientists of this story." Everyone laughed and toasted, but there was something deeply true in the young woman's observation. The ants really were the scientists of the story, patient observers, meticulous researchers, preservers of knowledge, builders of the future. And they remained there indifferent to human celebrations, following their eternal trails, carrying their tiny treasures, keeping alive a wisdom that transcended species, generations, and cultures. They were living proof that the best discoveries come from those who know how to observe what others ignore, who have the patience to learn from unlikely teachers, and who understand that true wealth lies not in the treasures we find, but in the knowledge we gain and share in the process of finding them. 25 years after that first morning, when David observed ants carrying golden fragments, the backyard had become a national heritage site. The house had been transformed into a living museum where visitors could learn about sustainability, traditional knowledge, scientific observation, and community development. David, now 59 years old, had become an emeritus professor at State University and an international consultant in sustainable development. Rachel directed the National Institute of Solidarity Economy. Eleanor, at 19, was simultaneously completing 2 doctorates, one in entomology and another in anthropology, and was already considered one of the most promising scientists of her generation. "You know what impresses me most about this whole story?" said Professor Stephen, now 85 years old, during one of his monthly visits to the backyard. "It's that the ants remain exactly the same. They weren't impressed by anything we accomplished. For them, we simply did our part in their work." Maybe that's the real lesson, replied David. We're not the protagonists of nature. We're just participants in a story much bigger than ourselves. And when we understand our place in that larger story, we discover our true power, added Eleanor, who had just returned from an international conference on biomimicry. She had returned from Ivy League University, where she had presented her latest discovery. Ants of different species on different continents exhibited similar behavioral patterns when exposed to mineral deposits. This suggested that the ability to read the geological composition of the soil was a fundamental evolutionary trait of social insects. If we're right, she said to the family gathered in the backyard, we can use ants to detect not just gold, but any kind of mineral. Imagine the applications: space exploration, precision agriculture, pollution detection. Are you saying ants can teach us to colonize other planets? Asked Rachel, impressed. I'm saying they already know things about geology that took us centuries to discover, and if we learn their language, we can dramatically accelerate our understanding of the world. Eleanor's vision was ambitious but not unrealistic. Her studies had shown that ants reacted to mineral variations in the soil with precision superior to electronic equipment. NASA had already expressed interest in her methods for future missions to Mars. My daughter is going to teach humanity to talk to ants to explore the universe, David joked. I think Grandma Eleanor would approve. I'm sure she would, Rachel agreed. She always said nature had answers to every question. We just needed to learn to ask the right ones. That night, as they had done thousands of times over the years, the family sat on the porch to watch the ants. It was a ritual they maintained regardless of how many awards they received, how many conferences they spoke at, or how much fame they achieved. They are our most important teachers, said Eleanor, watching a particularly active trail. And the only ones who never took pride in teaching us. Humility, observed David. Maybe that's the most important lesson we've learned. No matter what we accomplish, there's always something more to learn from observers more patient and wiser than us. And teamwork, added Rachel. Each ant does a small part, but together they move mountains, like our cooperative, like our family, like any community that works well. Eleanor was silent for a few minutes, carefully watching an ant carrying a particularly large fragment. Then she turned to her parents with the sparkle in her eyes that always announced a new discovery. I just realized something I'd never noticed before, she said. Ants aren't just teaching us about geology and teamwork. They're teaching us about time. What do you mean? Asked David. They work on a completely different timescale than ours. A colony plans for decades, centuries. They make investments whose returns won't be seen for generations, like Grandma did when she buried the treasures. And like we did when we created the Sustainable Cooperative, Rachel finished. Exactly. Grandma learned from the ants to think in terms of generations, not just years. That's why her plan worked perfectly. She thought the way they think. Eleanor's observation opened a new perspective on the entire story. Grandma Eleanor hadn't just used the ants as a navigation system. She had adopted their temporal philosophy, planning for a future she wouldn't see, investing in benefits she wouldn't personally enjoy. That's why it worked out so well, said David, amazed. She wasn't thinking about solving immediate problems. She was building a legacy for multiple generations. And now I understand why she chose you, Eleanor told her father. You had the patience and the observational ability needed to understand a message left across decades. And you inherited that ability in amplified form, Rachel observed. You can see patterns that take us years to notice. Eleanor smiled, but her expression revealed she was thinking about something even bigger. I'm having an idea for my next project, she said. I want to study how different traditional cultures around the world developed symbiotic relationships with social insects. I have a suspicion that our story isn't unique. You're going to travel the world studying ants? Asked Rachel. I'm going to travel the world studying wisdom. The ants are just one of the teachers, but I suspect indigenous peoples on several continents developed similar knowledge by observing different species. The project Eleanor was conceiving was ambitious, a global mapping of traditional knowledge based on the observation of social insects. If she was right, there would be a treasure trove of ancestral wisdom waiting to be rediscovered in every part of the world. It would be like creating a world library of knowledge that connected humans and nature throughout history, she said excitedly. Imagine how many solutions to current problems might be preserved in traditions we consider primitive. My daughter wants to democratize ancestral wisdom, said David proudly, to make accessible to everyone what only a few guardians once knew. Like Grandma did with us, agreed Eleanor. She democratized the family's knowledge by making it accessible through observation. I want to do the same on a global scale. The idea was revolutionary, but perfectly aligned with everything the family had built. Democratization of knowledge, sustainability, respect for traditions, observation of nature, community development, all the values that had guided their journey could be applied globally. You're going to need a base of operations, Rachel noted, a place to coordinate worldwide research, receive international visitors, train new researchers. I've already thought about that, Eleanor replied. I want to build it right here on this property, an international center that preserves our local history while connecting with wisdom from around the world. The ant backyard becoming a world center for traditional knowledge, said David, amazed. Grandma really had no idea what she was starting. Or maybe she did, suggested Eleanor. Maybe she knew that planting a seed in the right person, at the right moment, could grow into a tree whose fruit would feed the entire world. At that moment, as if wanting to join the conversation about the global future, a particularly large ant appeared on the porch table carrying a golden fragment larger than usual. It stopped right in the center of the table, set the fragment down as if it were a gift, and then continued on its journey. They've approved the project, said Eleanor, laughing. We have the official blessing of the teachers. Then it's decided, declared David. We're going to build the International Center here, but with one condition. The ants have perpetual rights to the territory. They are the true owners of this land, and the first teachers of anyone who comes here to study, added Rachel. Obviously, agreed Eleanor. No one can understand traditional knowledge without first learning to observe, and there are no better teachers of observation than them. And so, on a starry summer night sitting on the porch of a simple house in a neighborhood once considered on the outskirts, an American family decided to create a center that would connect ancestral wisdom from all continents. All because 25 years earlier, an unemployed man had the humility to watch ants carrying small golden fragments. The ants continued their nightly work, unaware that they had inspired a project that would change the way humanity relates to traditional knowledge. They were just doing what they had always done, observing, learning, preserving, building, teaching by example. And perhaps that was the deepest lesson of all. The greatest transformations don't come from grand gestures or sweeping proclamations. They come from patient work, careful observation, the humility to learn, the wisdom to preserve, and the generosity to share. They come from tiny ants carrying tiny treasures, creating trails that connect distant past to unimaginable futures, in an eternal dance between nature and humanity that keeps teaching those who have eyes to see and hearts to understand. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this story of perseverance and discovery. Do you believe that small observations can change entire lives? Have you ever noticed details in nature that others overlook? Share your reflections in the comments. We love reading about your experiences. Don't forget to leave your like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other heartfelt stories about family, tradition, and wisdom. Thank you so much for your company on this journey.